What is up, y'all? It's your boy Anki coming at you with another video in the Rise of Villainy saga. This time we'll be discussing Jin Bubaigawara, aka Twice. And while he is a very popular character stateside and everybody, was freaking out during this arc this year, he's always struggled to seem to be popular over, in Japan. I think that really kind of partially comes down to cultural differences, but also just that his story isn't exactly one that always elicits sympathy to begin with. To a lot of readers, the series of unfortunate events that make Twice who he is are nothing but the bite of a lemon in comparison to the heinous taste of his crimes that he commits going forward. And it's especially so when you think about the fact that the defining characteristics of his childhood that seem to make him who he is and that seem to have led him to where he's become aren't actually superpower based, but rather based in our world and the monotony that it seems to be. In the world of My Hero Academia, even within multiple manga you've seen that are supposed to be based in real Japan, it seems that the idea of occasionally a high schooler having to drop out of school and working full time at the age of 16 is considered the norm. This would mean that while it is true that Jin lost his parents to the attack of a villain at the age of 5 or 6, this being a normalized thing, would it be seen as something necessarily too tragic for him to deal with? Rather, plenty of people within society have already risen to this occasion, have already managed to make a name of themselves without their parents around. So therefore, it doesn't matter that you don't have family. You should still be succeeding at this job that you work at and therefore not be a problem to the rest of us in society. I would argue that when you say it out loud, you realize that maybe the idea of normalizing 16-year-olds throwing away their lives to join the workforce and surrender their childhood while their peers are allowed to still grow and develop at a rate that is more comfortable and allows for them to focus on the different aspects of who they want to be as a person so they have more emotional development. I would say that maybe this is also a reflection within the writing of Horikoshi kind of calling out our own society, where a lot of times we think about how, within the context of Shigaraki, his story calls out the bystander effect that's been amplified through the complacency that is enabled by the quirk society. But the thing is that this is already a form of bystander effect that we have in our world right now, where many of us, if we know that there's other people who can handle a particular issue, maybe it's because of funds or whatever, maybe if we just simply don't have the time, we will entrust it to someone else without even necessarily finding another person. In this case, or at least in the context, it seems that in Japan, it has been accepted that children can occasionally give up their social lives. And even here in America, a lot of times when we read stories of children doing elaborate yard work or some other nonsense to raise hundreds or thousands of dollars to help offset their parents' debt, people paint it as this romanticized story when in reality it's a tragedy of a child surrendering their youth and their vigor to rectify the mistakes or the debts of an adult. So I think that certain callousness towards the idea of youth working being more normalized in Japan has made it where they don't necessarily see Twice having to work and be in that position as something that's necessarily sympathetic. But what I do think is important to note is that in the same way that being a felon or being a criminal can really damage your career here, it can do the same in Japan. That's kind of the boat that Twice ended up in. Because now, when you look at it from a chronological perspective, when we're introduced to what Twice's real life really started going off the rails, it's not actually an incident with this quirk that we all know about, but rather it's when a client, I don't know if it's a client's child or whatever, but somebody affiliated to a client got injured by Twice driving his motorcycle. In the process, though, Twice directly states, he ran out in the streets. It didn't matter. He was given a criminal sentence, he was charged, and this caused, a blemish on his record, only for him to also get fired because of the person being a client and them not being happy, and his boss not wanting to have to risk losing further clients with somebody who clearly doesn't care about, the stability of the job or the income. Now, that's obviously not the position that Twice was actually in at this time, but this is the one that's being posited by the people around him due to the fact that he simply got into an automobile accident, and that's it. And so now Twice is at a point where he's homeless, he doesn't have family, he doesn't really have a safety net, and society has clearly already turned its back on him, and that's what leaves him with only his own, cynical thoughts, negative experiences, and ultimately, yes, he could maybe turn to something else, but when you can't get a job, you need to eat still. Your stomach doesn't care if the food you eat is acquired by legal means. What your stomach and body care about is that you acquire nourishment. And to get that nourishment, if that means breaking the law, so be it. And that's the position that Twice was placed in. Once you start having to be homeless and the only friend or ally you have on your side is a duplicate of you who is going to be equally jaded, equally frustrated, and remembers everything the exact same way that you do, to the extent where it begins to believe it is you, then you're not going to get another perspective besides we just need to do what it is to protect us because we aren't protected. So even if he's already an orphan, which in a lot of stories could contextually be seen as a tragedy due to the fact that he was able to, still go to school for a little while and get a job, he's seen as normal. This isn't something to lament, even if it does put him on a trajectory of less growth because he's spending more time focused primarily around survival. I don't agree with this, but this is ultimately the result that was placed upon Twice. Now, because of this, though, because he ends up in a position where he's so desperate and he's been alone this entire time, his clones still want the same thing that he does. They want that freedom, that ability to be comfortable that's been denied since he's a youth. When you've been working since you were 16 and you all of a sudden have the power, your goal is going to be to live easily. Now the clones, sharing all those same memories, aren't going to want to help him live easily under the assumption that he's real when they remember everything up to that point. To a certain degree, it's the same as when a rule is added in Undead Unluck, except this rule is just another you. They will remember everything exactly as if it has always been that way with them existing in the world, because as far as they are concerned, based on their memories, they might as well be you. There isn't a gloop gloop phase where they look at their hands and they're like, I'm a clone. There ends up being a lot of discussion, debate, and even during my Villain Academia, when they all should have been aware that they were clones, they still ended up arguing about it in the room with Destro. Now, the idea that Twice would inevitably end up being betrayed by his quirk and the people that were supposed to be him kind of sets him up into a position to where the League becomes the most valuable thing that he could ever have. A person whose life has been so fraught with disillusion, a person whose groups have consistently betrayed them, needs a home, place to be stable. One of the main things that made the League of Villains so valuable to Twice is that he is a person who had been consistently having his life destroyed in the hands of others and eventually by himself, through other himselves. And now he's eventually found a group in which he can be himself and trust himself to make these decisions and be around these people and entrust his relationships. Every person, be it his boss, the police, or himself, when disappointed in him, lashed out at himself in intense anger. Keep in mind, his boss was willing to fire him on the spot. The person who was hit by his vehicle, even though it was their fault, lashed out at him. The courts pretty much allowed him to be screwed over in these ways, and when the clones weren't happy, they too lashed out on him. Everybody, including his duplicates, had always lashed out on him. So that is what makes it so important that he met the League of Villains, not only because it gave him a place to be, but it gave him a place of forgiveness. It makes sense for a character that is so lost to strike home with the audience. In our own world, we have likely encountered at least one person that we look at and see life really handed them a raw deal. Just in a character that, when you look at the very beginnings of his story and how he came to be and his genuine trappings of the everyman, and during My Villain Academia especially, I would even often joke that he was effectively the shonen protagonist of the League of Villains. Though I would now say that is undoubtedly Shigaraki. Oh boy. That joke still remains, because the premise of that joke is moreover that he was, a blonde-haired, loudmouth, friend-loving character who basically used the Shadow Clone Jutsu. But the idea is that one of these things, the joke that Twice is a shonen protagonist, though, resonates with all of the League of Villains, really. They are consistently written as a protagonist group structure, and to a certain degree, when you look at the way their origins are and how Shigaraki is, it's very obvious that they have their own narrative plot and are treated as such, as characters with their own agency, in-game goals, and their actual agenda manifests itself in the forms of character interactions that show you that they have genuine reasons and ambitions for this, and they don't just function as narrative foils, but rather the plot is serviced by these characters. And earlier I mentioned how being forgiven was one of the most important things that has happened with Twice here. The thing is that by letting his own clones down, by disappointing them, they were willing to kill him. When the League was disappointed in Twice, when Twice accidentally led Overhaul to them and led to Big Sis Magne, sorry, he didn't accidentally lead Overhaul to them. That's not the accident. The accident was getting Big Sis Magne killed. When this happens, Twice feels an unshakable amount of grief. I think this is one of the moments that really starts to lead to the audience resonating with Twice's character, because he's come to a point where he is upset, he's lost a friend, and more than anything, he emphasizes with his mask off, pleading, "I'm human too, Shigaraki." He drives home a point that it's very easy to lose with characters in series, especially villains, that they are still supposed to be human. They're still supposed to have their vulnerabilities, their concerns, their motivations, and in this case, Twice wanted to protect his friends and failed, and in this moment was blaming himself incessantly. But unlike all the other times in his life, when Twice would struggle with things, when he would have a massive falling out, when he would have a failing, instead of him being the one that was on the hook for it, the League of Villains understood that while he may have been technically complicit, as he had enabled an Overhaul to find them, he was not the one responsible. Because the one responsible can only be the one who does the killing. And in this case, it's Overhaul. And this is what allows him to believe in each other and to go forth, and gives him the courage that he needs later on in the Overhaul arc, and the know-withal to come up with a strategy to betray Overhaul without any explicit directions from Shigaraki, because finally having someone believe in him allowed for him to believe in them and to see what the implications of that would really be, and would be to still service the League without being directly told, to help them get, ahead. One of the things that I do think is mildly highlighted in Twice's story, even though I don't think we talk about it a lot, is a bit of the class divide in Dreams. And what I mean by that is that you have characters like Aizawa, whose quirks, you could argue, aren't nearly as powerful as Twice. In fact, Twice is stated directly to have the power to crush a nation, and I am not the kind of man who would tell you that is wrong. And yet, due to the fact that Twice was forced into a lower economic class, due to the fact that Twice was forced to work at a young age, he was never even given the option to pursue hero work. He is one of the only characters in this series that we are introduced to that never contemplates heroism, who has never been shown to strive to be a hero at all, in fact. With the exception maybe being Toga. So we have, I think Twice and Toga, out of characters who have gotten extensive flashback focus, are the only ones who really didn't want to be heroes or aren't directly tied to someone who wanted to be a hero. Because Twice was too busy working. Toga was too busy going through school and being a kid and figuring things out, but also having a quirk that naturally would have pushed her away from being inclined to even think about being a hero. Her quirk made her want to drink blood. She had already been taught that her quirk was socially unacceptable. Therefore, I would say, if anything, her lack of wanting to be a hero is even also reflective of the class divide. Let's look at Dabi, a character who grew up being trained to be a hero, who eventually became jaded with the system. But he was given a good quirk and get economic privilege, and was, of course, in a position, good quirk relatively speaking, and was born of this, number 2 hero at the time. Twice didn't have any of that going for him. So as a character, he didn't ever think about really becoming a hero. And that's something in of itself, that the idea that anyone can be a hero is consistently dismissed within this series, both by All Might early on, and the idea that a quirkless person could be a hero, but also subtly with the idea that Toga doesn't even contemplate this, Twice doesn't pursue this, even with having one of the most powerful quirks in the series. And I think it's because of some of these different fundamental structures, such as the fact that a lot of his life is attached in making rational mistakes due to human conditions that aren't tied to the quirk-based society, that I think makes people not necessarily care that much for Twice. Sometimes I think people just see him as a crazy person, and that's about it. I think that might be what the overall view is across the sea, and that's why he's not that popular, but I cannot prove that, because in my eyes, Twice has been an excellently executed everyman, because at the end of the day, blue collar struggles comes up and now he just lands himself in some villainy. But one of the things that I also want to say is that Twice and Jin are introduced to us as more or less two separate characters. And the reason why I say this is because Twice is introduced as a character and the introductions to Jin Bubaigawara as a character are vastly different. Twice is introduced during the Forest training arc. He's wildly goofy. He's there to aid Dabi. He doesn't really do a whole lot besides be a body on the field and then take orders and make jokes. But we fast forward and we get the chapter in which we follow his perspective around the town. We see him listening to the newscast, and he's used as an audience surrogate without us knowing who he properly is yet, so that we can see how the average citizen is starting to feel about the uptick in crime, the way they feel about the movements of certain shadow organizations becoming, and in general, the fall of All Might and the rise of Endeavor. What are the thoughts going on in this? And then we transition him from simply being an audience surrogate to putting on his mask as he's about to split apart, revealing that he's Twice, and then learning about what the League of Villains have been up to during the time frame of the provisional license exam. It is no accident that this chapter was released. I mean, people always describe this as a random chapter, but this was actually the update on the League of Villains chapter that directly followed the end of the provisional license exam, which actually wraps up with Toga confirming that she was Kami and had acquired a sample of Deku's blood. So that Twice chapter wasn't even necessarily random. It was literally, this is your real quick play-by-play update on what the League of Villains has been up to, and this is how I'm going to introduce you to this character who was damaged by his quirk. So now you get to see, oh, this is a person who's been traumatized by his quirk. He's not necessarily all bad, and because his quirk broke his brain, so you kind of see him like, oh, like, yeah, like, this is already a really sympathetic dude. The jokes become a little less funny and a little bit more sad, but you still get to kind of laugh along because, you know, he's still trying his best. And that's kind of where, you know, you really get to but one of the things about this is that just like many actual protagonist or good guy characters, Twice's power scaling is directly tied to his character progression to a certain degree. And once we get to My Villain Academia, after we've gone through the overhaul arc, after we've gotten these experiences where we get to see him use his brain to try to steal Eri, we see him, you know, really trying to find ways to help Overhaul get screwed over, eventually leading to Overhaul losing his arms because of the coordination between him, Toga, and Mr. Compress on the phone. We kind of get to move towards My Villain Academia, where now, while Overhaul arc, we could have asked questions. Maybe this is just Twice doing this for revenge. Maybe that's, you know, what his motives are. That's when we finally get to full confirmation, like, this is just about friendship. This is about who he is. The League of Villains consistently bring up how he always gets this way with his friends. Mr. Compress makes it a point to compare his origins after he clones himself to be comparable in line with the story of a hero, not a villain. But more than anything, that arc shows you how much Twice actually cares for the League as a whole. And even when he gets his arms broken, instead of him crying and being upset that he's in pain, he's crying and he's at joy because he knows he's real and he can actually do something to help his friend Toga, who's about to be murdered. Twice is a man who rages for the sake of others before himself, just like Deku. We're shown this heroic spirit, and this is the kind of things that Hawks was referring to when he told Twice that he was a good person. He saw in him these same things that are tied with so many good hero characters, or that are attached to the idea of being a great hero within him. Now here's the thing, is that once Twice unlocked his trauma, once he had finally accepted that he was real, once he'd been able to fight back, once he finally, you know, put his arms in braces because he had started the Sad Man's Parade and been doing enough damage and saved Toga, so once he had seen that was rolling, he was finally able to take care of himself. His power scaling arc had basically been completed. Twice was now unlocked. He was going to be able to be the big threat that the heroes were always going to have to fear him being. And that put him on a timer. And that's why, as soon as My Villain Academia ends, we find out that Shigaraki is getting more power. And as soon as All for One was slated to be given to Shigaraki, we had to lose Twice, because Twice having the ability to make clones of Shigaraki, Twice having the abilities to make clones of Makia, just having Twice having the ability to make clones of himself when combined with a Shigaraki that can already destroy cities made him too much of a threat. So narratively, how do you get rid of him? And how do you make it good? How do you make it not contrived? How do you make it not terrible? How do you make it not suck? Well, you do what Horikoshi did. You play into this. You see, Twice has been built up as this everyman who, at the end of the day, even if he does some bad things, yes, his views on murder, extortion, kidnapping, drug trafficking, arms dealing, all those could use a bit of work. But a man who's so dedicated and truly believes in supporting his friends is someone that you can't completely consider bad, which is something that Twice himself tells Hawks, to which Hawks sadly seems to subconsciously agree with. Now, the way you do this is you set him up in a position, just like before, that plays into his character flaws. He decides to believe in Hawks. Hawks exploits this because he's a double agent. So in the same way with Overhaul, where he just led him to a location and things go bad, now he accidentally gives Hawks all the details of all the infrastructure of the hideout, what their plans are, where Shigaraki's going to be so that he can power up. Reveals everything only for it to cost them everything. You see, what makes this especially poetic is we talk about with Twice's death how it's painful because he was stabbed in the back by a hero. We talk about how Twice's death is tragic because just like how his life was taken from him by his clones and he was never able to live quite properly again mentally, his very death scene was taken from him by a clone, one who had fallen off the balcony and still managed to reach Toga in time to save her and compress from the weird the hero with the swoopy arms. We see that, but the thing that makes his death especially tragic, but also just goes to show just how many layers that Horikoshi has weaved within this character arc, is that he dies the same way he arrives, a pawn in Dabi's plans. When we are introduced to Twice as a character, he's just following Dabi's orders, making clones of Dabi to enable Dabi to do what he needs to do, succeed in his mission, and ultimately help him capture Bakugo, who, by the way, Dabi is what they wanted in Bakugo anyway. The idea of taking one of the hero's kids, a hero kid from the elite prestigious institute, and then going ahead and revealing that and using that against them. But you know what? Instead, that plan fails. Dabi could have revealed himself as Toya then, but he chooses to wait. He waits until eventually Dabi brings in Hawks, who is a person who befriends Twice, so now Twice is not only technically being betrayed by Hawks here, but to a certain degree you can argue being betrayed by Dabi, because Dabi says he doesn't believe in him and he's just using him as a tool anyway, but Dabi is also now enabling him to be deceived by Hawks. Hawks deceives Twice. Hawks gets caught in 4K, stabbing Twice in the spine and the heart through the back. So what happens with his final moments? Instead of his final moment actually being, when he was stabbed, instead of his final moment being when he said goodbye to Toga, his final moments are once again being utilized by Dabi as a pawn to take down Hero Society and, have his murder used against them so that he can finally succeed. Twice is introduced as a character and removed as a character by the same methods, by the will and guidance of Dabi. And that in of itself, I think, is an interesting aspect to his writing, because I don't think we really talk about that aspect of their relationship. It's stated in the data books that, Twice is seen as a blood brother or a battle brother, but at the same time, these are the same data books they gave Dabi in S and Mystery. So it's really hard to tell where Dabi stands on this, but at the same time, he directly states that Twice dying made his dreams harder to accomplish, whether that's because he just simply thought about losing the powerful asset, or whether it's because he truly valued him. I'm still not sure. But Twice's mission, throughout the story narratively has been to aid Dabi to achieve his dreams, the same way that Spinner seems to be latching on to Shigaraki to help him achieve his. Jin Bubaigawara is honestly one of my favorite characters. I think there's a good reason and good merit to find sympathy and attachment to him. His character arc is one that Horikoshi set up fabulously, and giving us comedic reasons to find his presence on the screen enjoyable, and then to weave in the tragedy of his quirk incident, and then eventually give us the story of his childhood and how that all went awry, giving him both superpowered and regular human reasons for his life to be damaged, showing us the full complexities and nuances and ways in which this society still can hurt people. I think what's especially good about Twice is that it's very easy when we read My Hero Academia to assume that, yes, they have all these quirk issues, but a lot of the issues of old would be resolved. But that's not really the case here. What Horikoshi is telling us is that not only do we have quirk-based society issues, but the ones from here and now, they're still present and rampant. So when I think about a character like Twice, I think about one that shows both the failings of hero society and the ways in which we ourselves can do better as a whole. And I think that while Twice is indeed a man who's always falling in this journey, it's fair to say that many of us fell for the charm of his character. He's a guy that truly came from the mud and was constantly getting handed the raw deals. Considers Twice to be one of the best Horikoshi. Twice is one of the best characters crafted by Horikoshi. He is one that it's designed for us to feel sympathy with, not as a villain. Twice isn't written to be this super-powered, insane villain who happens to have a shred of humanity, but rather, Twice is written to be Jin Bubaigawara, a human who happened to have fallen into poverty and several other issues, and due to whatever his quirk happened to be, falls down a further rabbit hole and is eventually spurned by the society that always neglected him, and is eventually left for dead and murdered. But I also think that one of the things that we can take away from Twice is not only just a sad, somber message of the way society can hurt you, but also that for everyone within the everywhere, there is somewhere. So there will always, depending on where you go and the people you get to know, be a place for you. Let me know if you guys enjoyed the video or not. Like, subscribe, or comment below. See you Sunday for the Church of MHA. Anarchy is out.